All right, welcome everyone. We will get started now and let those that are going to join us when they can. Thank you so much for joining us today during our May alumni career event. We are so excited to have you today. We are talking about uncommon careers in all ways that are uncommon. We know UChicago, that is one of our favorite words here, uncommon. And I'm really excited to be joined by agent turned entrepreneur, Rupal Patel. We're going to talk a lot about her career, so I won't take away all the fun of talking about it now. But Rupal started off as a CIA agent where she was briefing military generals and going into jungles and war zones, and now works in corporate boardrooms and international stages. Like I said, we're going to talk about all of it, but her career has been incredibly interesting and incredibly wonderful. If you have questions throughout, we are going to take them as they come in. So please throw them in the chat, throw them in the Q&A. And we're really excited to have you join us, Rupal. Thank you so much for being here.
Yay, I'm looking forward to being to this chat and to all of the questions that are to come.
Amazing. So we talk a little bit about how you got here on your way through Chicago. So you started off at Columbia, right? Getting your bachelor's degree in political science, and then joined us over here at UChicago to get your master's in international relations. I always like asking people when I hear this, what they majored in. What was your dream career when you were picking out these degrees, when you're going through school? What was the career that you thought, this is what I want to be when I grow up?
I didn't have one. So, the reality behind my story is now even now it doesn't make coherent sense. But a lot of people sort of see it and they're like, oh, wow, that was really interesting. You must have had sort of planned it or thought about it or wanted this for such a long time. And the reality is, no, I was one of those kids who, and even as an adult to some extent, just never really knew what I wanted to be when I grew up, because I was interested in so many things. I was good at so many things. And like many fellow Chicagoans, probably most, I was good at school. And so even in high school, for example, when I was thinking about college, and, everyone goes, at least in America, goes through a guidance counselor process. And my guidance counselor, I remember this conversation, it was so unhelpful. She was like, Rupal, your problem is going to be that you could be good at anything. So deciding what you do is going to be your challenge. I was like, thanks, but what am I supposed to do with that, right? And so the way things unfolded was effectively, I just did lots of little mini experiments. And the way I refer to it sort of in my book and in other places is sort of following the leads, because I was, like I said, I'm interested in a lot of things. I loved learning languages. I loved living and traveling overseas. I love big challenges and knotty problems. And again, like a typical Chicagoan, love indulging the life of the mind, right? And so when I was an undergrad, I experimented with lots of different majors. I started out with sociology, then I did econ for a while, then I thought I was going to be an engineer, then I very briefly veered off into being pre-med, and then I landed on political science because it sort of was able to pull in a lot of threads from different things, and I also just had to pick something. I was a junior at this point. And so that's how that sort of happened. And then because of that major, the summer of my junior year of college, I applied to be an intern at the State Department Embassy in Muscat, Oman. And I got the internship. And so the State Department, for those of you who might not know, has a summer internship program for college students. And I had never heard of Oman before. That's how ignorant I was. I had to look it up on a map when I got my acceptance letter, and so I just went off and spent a summer living the life of a diplomat as a 19-year-old. They because it was a small embassy, they gave me some decent responsibilities. I got to sit in on a lot of interesting meetings. And so that's where I first got the taste for a life lived overseas, but it was by no means a grand design that I just faithfully executed on.
Amazing. Amazing. Yeah, I think that's a very UChicago trait. I'm sure many of our alumni in the audience would think that to be that you could do anything you want. You just kind of have to pick it and choose. That's sometimes the hardest choice, is making that choice to stick with one thing and go with it.
Yeah.
So then you graduate UChicago with your master's degree, and you are off to the CIA, which is a very cool, I mean, I'm sure we're going to talk about how cool of a job it was to do, but it's very cool to say even. What was that transition like, moving from, graduate school straight into a role that is pretty intense and pretty, you know, hands-on from day one.
Yeah.
What was that like? And sort of how did you use the U Chicago knowledge and experience that you built to make that transition?
It's interesting because in some ways I was really ready for it, and in other ways it was like a slap in the face. So what I was ready for, or why I was ready, is because the background investigation process took almost exactly a year. So I was going in for evals and polygraphs and interviews and all of this stuff for the better part of a year, and then just spent a long time waiting to hear back. And so by the time they called me and were like, okay, when are you ready to start on duty? I was like, oh, thank God, I've been waiting for so long. So from that perspective, I was just ready and raring to go. But when I was finally in the building, what was sort of a bit of a, sort of a cold splash of water was, sort of a typical experience for many of us when we go start anything new, whether it's undergrad or any degree or even a job. You don't know what you don't know, and everything is new, and you're having to learn everything from scratch. And for me, one of the most poignant parts of that sort of early uncertainty and that early incompetence, to some extent, that everyone faces in a job, came to a head where I pride myself on my writing and being a good writer, and of course, again, all of that analytical prowess that's honed at Chicago. And I remember the first paper that I wrote at the agency. It was for, I can't remember who the customer was at the time. I think it was the Secretary of Defense or someone in the cabinet. And I wrote this, analytical piece. It was very short, it's about a page. And my senior analyst came back with comments, and it was blood red with comments, suggestions, changes, poking holes in my argument, all of the things. And I was like, oh my God, because a couple of things. One, I had never written a piece for the agency before. So there is this, there's a typical agency style, but also it was the slap in the face of like, oh my God, someone hasn't just like bowed down before me and told me everything I do is amazing, which, for many of us, again, from undergrad through grad school, we are used to being really smart and just getting good grades. And so it was a really nice, in a way, sort of humbling moment, because I remember thinking very consciously, and I've always been this way, I'm never the type of person to shy away from constructive criticism or negative feedback, as long as it is helpful in some way. And that was my first instance of where I had to very consciously remind myself of like, look, this person is a seasoned senior analyst. You are week 4 or 5 into this job. Make sure you learn from this person, because one, they wouldn't have gotten to the senior service unless they were really, really good. And two, of course, I was green and new. So who better to sort of show me the ropes than someone who had that experience? So those first few, I would say almost 18 months, not even, it was a relatively extended time period, was just a constant learning experience of learning not just how to do things in sort of the traditional, sort of CIA style or whatever, but also just learning the ropes, learning the politics, both internal, but also how our agency related with, the president's office or with, the various departments, government agencies that we were serving. And so it was just basically constantly being in input mode, and at times it was overwhelming because there's a lot to take in on top of the fire hose of intelligence that you're going through every day to develop an expertise. But I remember loving it. I remember loving feeling like I was the dumbest person in the room, not being proud of it, of course, but using that again as an opportunity to just learn as much as I possibly could.
That's amazing. And that you talked about some of the leaders and people that you worked with. I want to switch to a topic that you covered in your book. For those of you that don't know, today is Rupal's publishing day here in the US, from CIA to CEO, which we're excited for her to join us today. And in the book, you talk a lot about the leaders that you worked with, and also the leaders, like developing your own leadership skills. And I'd love for you to talk to us. You kind of call it identity-driven leadership in the book. And I'd love for you to talk about how you went about developing those leadership skills, not just in the CIA, but obviously in your later careers as well. And what were like some of the most important factors or lessons or skills that you had to learn from to build those leadership skills?
Oof. So a couple of things, I guess. Leadership is such a big sort of topic, right? And I think for me, one of the things that I appreciated most about the leaders that the good leaders that I worked with at the agency was that they didn't try to conform to any pre-existing notion of what a leader looked like. So, for example, when I was serving out in the field and my chief of station, when you're in the field at the CIA, it's full of case officers and, sort of some people who feel like they have to live up to that sort of James Bondy style of, what people think being a spy is all about. And when I was in Afghanistan, my chief of station could not have been less the stereotype. He was very quiet. He wasn't brash and sort of pounding the table and loud and in your face. He was very thoughtful. He was very not at all a James Bond type. And he just focused on the mission. He didn't care about all of the nonsense about politics and hierarchy and rank. He was like, if you're the best person to do the job and you're the most qualified, then you do it. I don't care if it's going to, give you FaceTime with somebody really important, or it's going to, mean that I don't get to sit in on, this meeting or whatever. He was like, he was the epitome of sort of what we refer to internally as sort of a flat leader, right? Leading a flat organization where hierarchy is less relevant. And it was really powerful because in a military context, when you're in a military combat arena, hierarchies are actually really important to some extent, right? Chains of command and all that kind of stuff. But he showed a different way of leading that, yes, of course, the buck still stopped with him and he was the final decision maker, but he shared responsibility, he shared authority. And that was a really, really powerful example. And there are a couple of other leaders in particular that, that I worked with that sort of were similar in that vein, where they didn't try to be something they were not. They didn't try to live up to a certain stereotype or an archetype. And, they just got the job done. And again, really just let the good people around them shine when a lot of other leaders would have hoarded all of the glory for themselves. And so much of what that trial by fire and that experience there taught me about leadership is that it can literally look like anything you want. We still to this day in the 21st century have so many crazy notions of what a leader is supposed to look like and how a leader is supposed to behave. And again, it's usually a sort of, a very assertive, aggressive, loud, shouting, sort of slightly obnoxious boss who doesn't really care for the people around them. And the reality is just not that, and everybody who's here, might have had an experience of someone like that, but also probably have had experiences of someone who's not at all that way and learns how to lead from within an organization as opposed to sort of beating people until they do what you want kind of thing. And so what I refer to in the book as identity-driven leadership is first and foremost about identifying your personal strengths. Because again, so many people think, okay, well, once I become a VP or an MD or I don't know, CEO or whatever level of leadership you attain with a title, they think that, okay, well, I have to do this a certain way, or I have to act a certain way, or change this part of myself, or change that thing. And that's not true. I mean, the reality is the world is full of diverse personality types. So of course it takes diverse personality types to lead other people. But so often people feel like they have to become someone they're not, and that's not sustainable. And so when I talk about identity-driven leadership, it's not about identity politics or demographics or anything like that. It's about you as an individual, really zoning in on what are my unique strengths, what are my unique things that I just really, really excel at, and using that to drive your leadership style, to drive your organization, your team, whatever, and leave all of that other stuff about what it's supposed to look like and how you're supposed to be and what the person before you was like and all of that other stuff. Just leave that outside and focus on being your best version of a leader as opposed to somebody else's version of a leader.
That's amazing. Yeah, I think you also talk, you had a TED Talk, which is really exciting and great to listen to, where you talk about something I think at U Chicago we are all familiar with, which is owning your weird. And you applied it specifically to, the work that you were doing at the CIA, but can you talk a little bit about what that was like? Because that's a part of people's identity, right? Is if you're quirky, you're weird, you're really intense about the things that you love and intense about the things that you're interested in. I could see how that's a part of developing your skills and your leadership. So can you talk about sort of like what that path and that discovery was like for you?
Yeah, I guess, again, like coming in as an outsider, I had all of these notions of what being at the CIA would be like and what the people around me would be like and all of that kind of thing. And the reality on the inside, and again, this is true for a lot of organizations, the reality on the inside is, of course, so much more complex and so much more diverse in every way possible. And for so long, one of the things that I talked about in my TED Talk is, for so long, I viewed myself as an outsider, like as not totally fitting in any one world or any other, or not being sort of alpha enough for this context, but being sort of too assertive in this context, and all of that stuff that we confront when we are feeling like there's a tension between who we are naturally and what we think is expected of us in a work context. And the beautifully refreshing thing about being at the CIA was, yes, you had all of the stereotypes. You had the nerds who just, sort of the analysts and the big brains who were very, very introverted and hated interacting with human beings. And you had the other extreme of like the big, brawny, hard charging, aggressive alpha types, and literally everything in between. And so all of a sudden, any one personality quirk or multiple personality quirks wasn't really quirky anymore, because everybody just had their own thing. And I referred to a couple of examples where there was one of the most, actually, and she's a fellow U Chicago grad, one of my colleagues is an incredible big brain Chicago, typical Chicagoan, but she became a bomb technician, and she still is a bomb technician. And on the side, she's an incredibly talented chef. I mean, sort of like Michelin star quality rated chef. She's just amazing with doing everything and anything with her hands, but she's also, like I said, a bomb tech. That's not typical. She's not a stereotype of what you would see on TV or in any film. We had, guys who were doing security for some of the personal security detail out in Afghanistan, and they were literally some of the most, I won't say timid, because they obviously had physical sort of strength to them, but were just really internal, really thoughtful, would quote Dostoevsky, and, were really well read. And again, not the stereotype. And so I think, it's not anything groundbreaking, but the reality is everybody's complex. Everybody's a little bit weird in some way. Everyone has a quirk. But if everybody's weird and everybody's complex, then nobody is, right? And I think we just need to sort of get a bit more comfortable normalizing the fact that human beings are not just one thing or another, or even just five things. We're all, multifaceted in every context. And sometimes certain elements of our personalities are more relevant in some contexts, and in other contexts, other parts of our personality get activated and others get muted. But it's being conscious and aware of that process, as opposed to always feeling like, oh God, I don't fit in here. Oh God, I don't belong here. It's like, well, no, I do belong here, because I'm here for a reason in this room or at this conference or at this job or in this meeting or whatever, and focusing on why you do belong and what you bring, as opposed to all of the other things that sort of might make you feel like, you're sort of, yeah, you are a fish out of water, because again, the reality is everyone is going through that conversation in their heads.
Amazing. Yeah. And you talked, I know it's hard to summarize all of the years and all the work that you did there, but as you move on to sort of the next part of your career, is there anything that like particularly stuck out during your time at the CIA that you thought, this is a leadership lesson, or this is a life lesson or a career lesson that I am going to take into everything that I do from now on? Is there anything that you were like, this is a moment that's like, this is going to be with me forever?
Yeah, I think it was just more the mindset of this notion that literally anything is possible. Anything is not possible all at the same time and in every single situation, but it was a living example of how you would face impossible situations or impossible tech challenges or impossible physical challenges. And as an agency, as an organization, the focus was always on how do we find a way through. You didn't always make it through. You weren't always successful, but just that indomitable mindset of like, let's give it a go. Let's try. We're not going to let the situation or the context or whatever enemy determine our effort. And we're going to see what we can make possible. And so just having that really expanded notion of possibility was really, really powerful, because I think that's important in every aspect of our lives. We're so limited, or sometimes we limit ourselves by, oh, that will be too hard, or, I don't have a head for this, or I'm not a natural at that. Fine, maybe that is true. It might not be, it probably isn't. But how could you make it possible? Always asking that question of like, well, how could we do this thing, or how might we do this thing, and again, the reality is sometimes there are just things that you can't do, but at least stretching the notion of what is possible, both for you as an individual, but then of course at the agency as an organization, was, yeah, it was just, it was a constant sort of low drip that I felt that I was being fed just by being in that environment.
Amazing. And moving on, I think, so you spend many years at the CIA, you do amazing work, you're briefing some of the highest government leaders, you talked about being in Afghanistan, and you travel a lot and doing this sort of invaluable, highly important work. And then you decide, you know what, it's time for my next adventure. I can see how that would be kind of daunting to leave something that you've known, and also that you're doing really well at and getting all this high praise for. So what was that decision like, to decide that you want to find the next adventure, move on to the next thing? And how did you kind of decide that yourself, and how did you go about, making that choice?
It wasn't like I woke up one day and I was like, oh, I want something different. It was just this slow, sort of steady creep. I would say about almost 2 years before I left, that I just started thinking like, and again, it was an open-ended question. It was, am I going to do this for the rest of my life and career? And I could definitely see myself making a lifelong career there. Or is there something else? And it was just, again, constantly sort of, that question just kept coming back again and again and again and again to me. And it was, so I left the agency when I was 31. And, as some, in the audience may resonate with, as we get to sort of big milestone birthdays, we often think these questions around like, what does it all mean? And where am I going? And, have these more reflective conversations with ourselves. And I think it was a combination of like the time that I had been at the agency, plus, this sort of big birthday, which now seems like, why did I think it was so big? Because 30 is not big. But it was sort of an internal, I guess, evolution. And there was no obvious answer, nothing that was outside that I was desperate to do or try or whatever. But I just kept looking, keeping my eyes open, and doing little mini experiments. And then finally, I just thought, well, there's a couple of things. One, I started to feel like I didn't want to get comfortable. And I was, as you said, sort of doing really well, getting praised, doing interesting things, loving what I was doing. But I didn't ever want to get to the point, especially at a place like the CIA, where I felt like I was just coasting, because that's not exciting to me. And I like to constantly push myself and challenge myself. And so I was, looking around what that might be. And then I thought, well, okay, I have sort of worked in the public sector for this long. Let me give it a go in the private sector and see if I can hack it in the real world, right? And like the cold capitalistic world out there, and see how that goes. And so I did what I thought was actually relatively safe. I left in a relatively safe way, which was to go back to school, because I didn't know anything about business. And so I thought, well, let me go to business school. And at the very least, I will learn the foundations and the language of, finance and marketing and, sort of all of that stuff, and have that core knowledge that will hopefully then, serve me well in whatever comes next. And it was also a relatively low risk move, because one, getting a degree will always come good in some capacity, but two, if I left the agency and found that actually I didn't like what the big bad world had to offer, or wasn't interested in whatever came next, I always had the option to go back. Now, whether that is a real option or it was just something that I believed, I'll never know, because I didn't test it. But my feeling was like, you know what, I've done it. They know what I'm capable of. I could probably go back. And others had also left and gone back. So it felt safe-ish. Now, in my heart of hearts, I knew I would never use that fallback option, but I had it if I needed it. And different people have different risk appetites. And so I think, again, thinking back to sort of the topic of this conversation about careers and career pivots and changes and things, I don't think there's anything sexy or particularly laudable about making a precipitous change just for its own sake. Like, if that doesn't work for your risk appetite or the realities of your life, don't do it, or find a way to plan it in a different way. And that's how it worked for me. It was like safe because I was getting a degree. It was safe because I could potentially go back to the agency. And I just wanted to stretch myself in a different way and test myself in a different way, but always knowing that, if it ever really got that bad, I could sort of go back to what I was doing before, and it didn't feel as big and scary as it would have otherwise.
And not only did you decide to venture into the world of business, but you are an entrepreneur. You have started
Yeah.
your own businesses. So what was that choice like, right? Because it's one thing to say, I'm going to go and try out this whole new field and maybe join something that isn't the same, but similarly structured and, similar kind of environment. But you went off and said, I'm going to get this degree and then I'm going to go and start out kind of on your own. What prompted you to take it that far? And was that a secondary choice? Was that always part of the plan? How did that come about? Because it's very brave to go out and say, I want to do my own thing.
Yeah. So again, it was sort of an experiment because I very quickly, so I did a 2-year full-time MBA program, and I very quickly realized I didn't want to be a consultant or work in finance in any capacity. And there's nothing wrong with those industries. It just wasn't for me. And so I just thought, okay, well, that's what everyone is supposed to do, right? You're supposed to go and work at, I don't know, McKinsey or JP Morgan or, these really impressive brands after you get your MBA. And I sort of dipped my toe into that process. I did some interviews. I went to some of those info sessions, and I just, like I said, very quickly realized it wasn't for me. If I was going to make this change worth making, then I didn't want to go back to another big organization, another potentially bureaucratic organization. And so I thought, again, let me see what else is out there. And so I started, this is now back in 2011, 2011. And I was in London, so I got my MBA in London. And I just, the sort of the startup ecosystem, as it were, was starting to get bigger and more interesting here. I went to all of the startup events, both on campus and in London more generally, and hackathons and pitch competitions and VC competition, all of this stuff. And I sort of got I won't say a bug, but I was like, this might be what it is for me, because I loved the idea of being the ultimate controller over my professional destiny and not having to work for somebody else. And I just thought, if I'm testing myself, this is the ultimate test. Let's go for it. Again, I've got a certain amount of a savings pot that can give me about 2 years of a runway. So I'm not starving and, homeless. I've got this potential career fallback of, going to the agency. And, worst comes to worst, I'll go work at Starbucks. Like, I'm not worried about, sort of the pride of, oh God, I've got all of these degrees. Like, I was ready for anything. And so I just threw myself into the deep end after eliminating other options. And then the decision of which type of business to start and that kind of thing. Again, it was sort of a process of elimination, mini experimentation, all that kind of stuff. But I never felt like it was a one and done process. I always knew, the one thing I did always know from a relatively young age, so I'll say in my 20s, was I didn't want to just do one thing for the rest of my life. And I didn't know what combination of things it would be, but I knew I wanted what we now would call a portfolio career. And so even while I was building my first business, which is in real estate construction and development, I was still just like, okay, well, I'm liking this. I'm going to, put my all into this and, go 100%. But it might not be this forevermore. And who knows where this will take me. And so just sort of taking the ride and seeing where it would go, as opposed to sort of forcing it like, okay, I'm going to have to do this for the rest of my life. That's how it happened.
That's amazing. I think the idea of a portfolio career, I think, is something that's developed in the past like decade or so, and it is quite new. So I find that so interesting that you knew from an early age that was your interest. Hello.
Hi, we have someone who's broken into my office.
Welcome.
So until her father comes and gets her.
We're happy to have you. Anything that we can do. I just want to remind everyone as well that we have the chat and the Q&A option. Q&A option open. We are about halfway through right now. So if you have anything that you would love to talk about, love to ask, please throw it in either one of those places. But I also want to talk about, so you go from a career path in a world that's pretty regimented, right? The CIA, I think a lot of us think it thrives a lot on there's rules and there's, regulation, there's at least some sort of sense of order and organization. To now you are in a place where you're your own boss, you're setting your own rules and regulations, and you're not working with this huge team anymore. So what was it like for you to make that transition from someplace that was sort of like long-standing, organized, to something that's going out in the new world and deciding, I get to make the choices and I'm in charge of everything now?
It sucked in a word. And for a few reasons. One, like, I missed the social aspect of it. So I'm a pretty sociable person, and I loved just like having people around to discuss ideas and to just vibe off of. And I not going from that to, being in like an office environment, to then being in a sort of MBA environment, which is very social and very buzzy, to then being in my home office all day, every day by myself, building this thing that I didn't even know if it was going to succeed or fail. It was really hard. So I felt really lonely for large stretches of those, I would say, first sort of 2 years or so. And then the other part that was also took a while to find my rhythm with, that I wasn't prepared for, was the structure. And even outside of the CIA, again, pre-COVID, like there was a typical structure to a day. You would go to an office, you'd be there from, I don't know, 8 to 7 or whatever the typical working hours are, and you sort of there was a relatively predictable level of what your day was, or week or month was going to look like. But all of a sudden, when you're working for yourself, it's, I can do anything I want at all times to some extent, right? And so imposing that structure was really hard, because there would be months where I would literally just open up my laptop and look for things to do. Yes, it was all theoretically useful to building my business, but there was no structure. There was no one gave me a guide and was like, okay, spend 10 hours on this and 6 hours on that, or you just have to figure it out. Plus, for someone like me who doesn't really like structure, it was sort of hard to impose it on myself and to find the combination of structure and flexibility that worked best for me. And so that's, again, it was really just a really big experiment of finding what worked, finding what didn't work, being willing to try different things. But like I said, I didn't get to a happy medium, or with sort of an effective way of structuring my time, probably in sort of until a good year, maybe even 2 years into me being my own boss.
Yeah, I think that the idea of having to put structure on yourself is difficult, especially when there are so many possibilities out there. Sometimes it feels like, again, we talk about, coming from a U Chicago education where you have all these threads that you could be following. I think part of, I know I talked to some other entrepreneurs that are U Chicago graduates that say, it's hard to like figure out what you're supposed to be doing, because you could be doing everything at once.
Everything.
And it ends up becoming, sometimes you're doing nothing really at all.
Yes. Yeah. It's, I joke, because in the beginning of any business that you're starting, you're chief everything officer, right? And so everything is not equally valuable, but everything has to get done. And there is an element of also just like overwhelm, right? Because you're the person in charge of doing the business development and the sales and the marketing and the outreach and the building the website and ordering the printer paper and all of that stuff. And so it's, again, different people sort of come to find what works for them in different ways, but it really is about finding what works best for you that you can sustain, because what works for me is probably not going to work for you or the other person. But again, it's not about being dogmatic about like, well, I have to do this or I have to do that. It's about being a bit flexible in your, again, experimenting with what works and what doesn't, and then just sticking, and then trying it out and sticking with it for a while and seeing how that goes.
Amazing. And in that, you talked about sort of, there's like a bit of loneliness when you're first starting this out and you're a team of one. And you talk about in your book about building your teams. You talked about the teams of analysts that you worked for and operatives that you worked for at the CIA, but also you talked about finding, fellow leaders and entrepreneurs that you could relate to and talk to. We love the topic of networking here at U Chicago.
Yeah.
Topic. So how did you find that team of, fellow leaders, fellow entrepreneurs, fellow people who are, going out to start on their own and kind of taking charge of what their career was going to look like? How did you find them and how do you utilize them?
Again, it's just putting myself out there. So one of the things that I fundamentally believe, and this doesn't matter whether, or this is true whether you're in an employed role or early in your career or late in your career, or an entrepreneur, it doesn't matter who you are. The people that you surround yourself with will have a massive influence on you, and it's up to all of us to very carefully, I hate to put it this way, but almost audit the people that we're spending the most time with, because if you don't do that, you won't realize what influence they are having on your career, your health, your wealth, your relation, all of those things. Like literally every input, whether it's, a 10-minute conversation or, someone that you're spending all weekend with, all of these inputs leave an imprint. And yes, of course, some will leave a bigger imprint than others, but we all probably have people in our lives who we think of who are like just really negative and suck all of the energy out of us, or make us feel really bad after we've spent time with them. And then others who leave us feeling really motivated or really fired up and really inspired to do the things that we care about, and everything in between. And so these communities that I think we're talking about are important for building at every stage of your life. And it's about being very conscious of the communities that we're already a part of, and then changing the ones that are not serving us or our dreams or our values or our ambitions or whatever. And basically starting to spend less time in those contexts and more time in others. How do you find the more valuable or more helpful ones? You have to put yourself out there. So some of it is, for example, I don't know if you like want to start like running, or you want to take better care of your physical health, then it's being around people who are doing that. And for me, for example, when I was starting this my first business, which is in real estate and property, it was going to property and real estate networking events. It was going to conferences. It was reading the magazines, listening to the podcast, like doing all of those things. And then just seeing and then obviously for the in-person events and things like that, seeing who I connected with. I mean, you have to make an effort. They're not just going to fall into your lap, and people aren't just going to be like, hey, I want to connect with you just because you seem like a decent person. Like LinkedIn can be a really great resource. Alumni communities can be a really, really great resource. I know next week we have alumni weekend coming up. You'd be amazed at how many people in your own immediate network, friends, family, alumni, whatever, colleagues, former colleagues, could probably be a part of this sort of curated team of people, but you have to curate them. No one's going to give them to you prepackaged. And so the way I did it was exactly that. I, would go to the events, I would connect with alumni, I would meet with people for coffee, or now we have the option of doing it virtually. But you have to put in the effort, because everything that you care about, whatever ambition or whatever dream, or it could be, again, like I want to run a marathon, or I want to start a business, or I want to become CEO of my I don't know, ed tech company, or whatever it is. There will be other people in the world who have done that thing, or who are currently on that same path, who are worth bringing into your life, and other people who are probably pushing you and deviating you from going down that path successfully, who you need to sort of push away from your life. So be very conscious of those inputs and those people, but go out and find the ones, because they are there. And now with all of the like technology and media and blah, 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 and events, meetup groups and all that stuff, we're all spoiled for choice. So it's you have to put yourself out there.
And you talked a little bit about your first business here, but you also are the founder and CEO of a company that does some of this sort of leadership coaching that you're doing through us right now. So you coach executives and leaders and organizations about sort of how to build their own internal leadership structures, how to build their own internal goals, and also working with the leaders to become better leaders. So can you talk a little bit about how you made that jump to being, a 2-time CEO and founder, the first one, and sort of what was that like to now go from being the leader to being the leadership coach? Because that's a lot of expertise that you have in your wheelhouse.
Yeah. So again, it happened sort of by a process of evolution. And what happened, sort of the tangible way it happened, was as I was building my property and real estate business, I was doing all the things, networking, going out and all that stuff, connecting with alumni and other people, et cetera. And I found one of the things that I loved most about all of that was just sharing the things that I was learning. And so, at every stage, I was learning stuff about my specific industry, about sort of what it meant to be in real estate here in the UK, and then also a little bit about, real estate in the US, but then more broadly about the challenges and the process of like building a team, about how do you create a culture, about, self-leadership, about organizing your time, managing pressure and dealing with uncertainty, having to deal with investors, like all of the big and small questions that fall under leadership, I was living and just naturally sharing, what I was learning. And then these informal sort of sharing conversations turned into more formal requests from other people for me to either coach or mentor them in their own sort of process of building a company or leading a team. And then it just evolved and grew from there. And so as I was, my property business was probably about 6 years old, at the point at which I started to transition a bit more away from just focusing on that, because it didn't need me so much operationally anymore, and I could now focus on some of these other things that I really, really enjoyed doing: the sharing of the knowledge, the helping others with their complex challenges, and the big knotty issues and questions and that kind of thing. And so I just started formalizing it, and it's grown from me doing one-to-one work with just individuals to now working with companies and multinational companies. I've started doing a leadership development program for the White House, which I'm going to be kicking off next in a couple of weeks. Yeah, so it's sort of come full circle. but it happened through a process of evolution. I couldn't have told you even 5 years ago or 6 years ago that this is where I'd be now, but I just followed my own strengths. I followed my own interests, my passions, my all of that stuff, and just sort of built on the themes that kept recurring in my life. This theme of like developing expertise, of sharing it to help other people, of sort of putting myself out there and to help other decision makers. It's exactly what I did at the CIA. I saw a question come in earlier, but what exactly did I do? So my role at the CIA was sort of twofold. It was analyst, and it was also collector. And so as an analyst, I was sifting through sometimes tens of thousands of pieces of information and intelligence that we were getting, and then having to distill it and make sense of it for our policymakers. So the president, secretaries of all the agencies, generals, et cetera. And then the other part was helping our collection efforts in the field. So, going and talking to our case officers and helping them figure out, okay, well, this is valuable information. These are the gaps in our intelligence that we need to fill, and being part of that process. And so all collectively, it was really taking complex issues, complex data, huge amounts of data, and making sense of it in ways that were tangible and useful to the people who needed that information. And that's effectively what I'm doing now. Is being a leader in any capacity, running an organization of any size, is really complex, really full of uncertainty and challenges and unpredictability, and all of these various streams of just complexity that come into it. And I love that. I love, sort of diving into the specifics of a leadership challenge or a team challenge, or sometimes a big organizational transformation, and helping them with sort of seeing things from both the strategic level and sort of where there might be a mismatch between what they're doing and where they want to go, and then helping make those changes on a tangible level of like, okay, well, this is the vision, this is where we want to go, what we want to build, this is how we get there, and this is some of the processes we need to put in place, these are some of the trainings we need, all of that kind of stuff. So it's looking at leadership from a pretty big, as in a very big way, because it's not just about the people who have the title. It's also about how do you create a culture of leadership from within, where everybody takes ownership of a certain part of a problem or a project or whatever, and leads themselves through, to contribute through that. So again, it's like I said, I wish I could tell you that I ever sat back and said, okay, well, I'll do this for this many years and then I'll do this, but that's not how it worked. Everything is sort of built on itself, built on themes and strengths and things that I enjoy, and that I have some unique insights about. And then also, just like I said, trying different things and seeing what I enjoy, and trying to focus on more on that and where I can add value, as opposed to just focusing on one thing forevermore.
Amazing. And so we're going to get back to talking about your successes in just a moment, but I want to go maybe to the negative side and talk about, you have a chapter in your book called what it's called, When the Mission Goes Wrong. And I would love to talk about, because we've talked about all these great things that you've done. We've also talked a little bit about how there were times, you got that first briefing back and it was all marked up. You had to like learn to grow. So can you talk a little bit about maybe some times, or a time in any part of your career that something went a little bit wrong and you had to learn and grow from it? Because I think those are the moments that are sometimes more useful than a really great success.
all of them. So things always go wrong. Things still go wrong, right? Like, I think fundamentally people, yeah, I'm glad you asked this question, because too many people think like, oh, well, you reach a certain level or you reach a certain point in your career and it's just smooth sailing. That's never the case. The challenges always, 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 always are part of the journey. It's just your capacity to deal with them expands and grows and deepens with, time and maturity and some of, experience, etc. So God, when the early days of building my business, for example, it was nothing but a series of challenges. I remember probably for the first, I don't know, 3 projects. So, real estate is tangible. You sort of see when things are going wrong. We had all kinds of terrible contractors who screwed up, people who stole money from us, investors who said they were going to invest in a certain project and then literally pulled out 48 hours before they were supposed to send their funds over. We had, because of various sort of problems with one of our contractors, we then were 6 months behind on one of our projects, which then of course led to all kinds of issues with, our lending and with, other partners and things. And so, God, I can bore you to details with all of the challenges. At the CIA, one of the first times I had to brief. So when I was serving in Afghanistan, my main job was to be the briefer, the civilian intelligence briefer for the commanding general of the U.S. and international forces. And the first few times I went in there, it was like talking to a brick wall. I didn't know if he was listening. I didn't know if he was taking in anything I was saying. A couple of times he sort of asked me really aggressive, slightly leading questions, that effectively sort of suggested that he felt that I was criticizing him. So, there were these like interpersonal challenges. And it's like, okay, well, how do I establish not just my authority, but also my credibility with this person who's already sort of put me on the back foot? I mean, yeah, those are just a few examples of challenges that come to mind. And in every single one of them, I think the thing that saw me through is just sheer stubbornness and determination. But also this feeling of like, I'm not going to let somebody else or some investor or some asshole contractor or some bad piece of luck or whatever else determine whether or not I keep going. Yes, I could quit. And I very seriously, never at the CIA, but when I was starting my business, and especially in the first, I would say 18 months, there were many times where I was like, you know what, screw this, I'm going to quit. This is too much. People are too unreliable. That there's too much stuff that can happen or go wrong, and it's all going wrong. I'm just going to throw it in and go back and get a job. But I almost needed to go through that process to get it out of my system, and then realize that actually, no, I'm not going to quit. Like, I'm going to be the one who decides when I'm done. And it's not going to be because of this thing that's happened. I'm going to focus on what I can control. I'm going to go back and find another investor or find a different contractor or renegotiate the terms of this contract or whatever it is, and look for a potential solution. Again, going back to that thing I shared earlier about that CIA mindset of like, anything is possible. So it's your job to find a way or find what possible looks like in that context. So that's how it worked. It's a constant, for me, to be honest, Natalie, the reality of like success at anything, whether it's leadership or sports or politics, it's a head game. And managing that head game is what determines, I mean, yes, there are many other things, but fundamentally, for me and for many other leaders that I've worked with, it's managing the conversation in your head, managing your resilience, managing your energy, managing your emotions. That is what determines a lot of the success or failure. And so that's what I had to learn to do, is manage those things, is to see, okay, well, this is my instinct. This is my go-to move when things go wrong or when things go bad. How can I rewire myself to do something a bit more productive, right? And so it was a constant learning process. It was a constant evolution. Again, I'm using these words a lot, but that's what it is. And then it's paying attention to how I respond, and what isn't working, what is working, getting advice from people, all of that stuff. But for me, it's really about just mastering, or to the extent that you can, just constantly working on mastering your head game.
Amazing. Yeah. The idea of the head game and the idea of the sort of getting out of your own way sometimes, I think is really relevant to talk about in your book. And you also talk about sort of, there's this idea, I think, for a lot of people that it's hard to sort of brag about your own successes, or you feel a little bit like you are bragging. Bragging seems like a bad word to say, but so how have you, in the moments where you found success, in the moments where you've done an amazing thing, you've been invited to do things with the White House, you've written a book, you've done a TED Talk, how do you find the moments to feel as though you can sort of own your successes and brag about your successes? And also like sell yourself to the next thing, right? To go into a room and say, I'm good at this leadership coaching. I'm a great example. Like, let me help you. How do you sort of own your own skill set and your successes as you go into that?
I think it's the way I found my peace with it is just by sharing value. So it's not about, hey, look at me, like I've written this book and you should read it. It's, hey, these are some of the things that I learned that I've put into this book. If that will be helpful to you, please go and read it, or whatever it is. Or, in the early days of starting my business, it was never like, oh my God, I'm so amazing at this. And look at I mean, yes, with investors, you have to sort of prove your successes, but it was like, this is what I've learned. This is what I have to offer now as a, sort of as a strategist and a coach. This is what I have to offer. It's not about forcing myself on anybody. It's not about pushing anyone to buy anything or to, do anything. This is what I do. This is what I offer. If that will be helpful to you, let's talk. So I think it's less about, I think so many people think about sharing their successes as it has to be in your face and self-promoting, and it feels really slimy and whatever. It doesn't have to be any of those things if you don't want it to be. Yes, it can be those things if you do it that way. But if you've got a great success, one of the ways that you could share it is like, hey, I don't know, was promoted to X, Y, or Z position in, a record number of years, whatever the accolade might be. Here's how I did it. So it's not just about you, it's about help. And this is my bias. Maybe this doesn't work for everyone, but that's how I've felt comfortable doing it. Is this isn't just about me, because I know, even though I might not know everyone who's looking or watching or hearing or listening or whatever, there are people who are looking and watching and hearing and listening. And so it's not just about me and my journey, it's about what other people can get from it. Because there might be people who want inspiration about how to write a book, or how to, do leadership programs, or I don't know, how to start a business. And so if anything that I can share can help them do that, then that's how I want to talk about it. So it's not just about me, it's about the other people who are coming up next to me, behind me, in front of me, whatever, metaphor you want to use. It's about sharing it in a way that's relevant and valuable for them. Because fundamentally for me, that's how I approach pretty much everything that's sort of public, right? Whether it's social media or doing a talk or whatever, it's how can I share value? And if I don't feel like I'm sharing value, then it doesn't feel right to me. And so whenever possible, I make sure that any success that I'm sharing is also sharing value for other people.
Amazing. And in the book, you also talk about how to find your own style of working and your own sort of how you work best and what your best is. I think that's a hard topic for a lot of people, of like, how do I figure out, like, not just to go on the same schedule that everyone else is, or not to like, follow the successes of everyone, but what am I the best at? What is my best way of working? Can you talk a little bit about how you found that sort of that way of figuring out what's best for me and what's the right balance for me? Because balance is a big word, right? Too, is how do I find balance in all of this?
Yeah. So I actually don't think balance is the key. I think we talk too much about balance, and I think, excuse me, it gives the impression that one can balance all of the demands, personal, professional, emotional, all of the things perfectly. And that's just not reality, because anyone who's tried to balance 12,000 different things perfectly inevitably finds that 11,998 of them fall to pieces and you're left holding two. So my approach to balance is to be very conscious and very very clear-eyed about the trade-offs, and then choosing the things that you're going to focus on. So for me, what I have chosen to focus on right now at this stage in my life is my career and my immediate family. You saw, my 2-year-old daughter just came and interrupted our conversation earlier. I've got 2 young kids, one's 6, one's 2, and I have a career that I really, really care about. So right now, all of my focus and my highest energy, my most, valuable time, all of that stuff is going to go to those two things. Everything else, my physical fitness, my relationships with friends, my relationships with extended family members, everything else in my life is just going to get enough. So I'm not going to abandon it, but it's going to get just enough to keep ticking along so I don't die of a heart attack, or so I don't, sort of all suddenly find 10 years from now I don't have any friends, or, my parents don't know who I am. But I refer to it as the heptathlete approach to life, right? So any of you guys who like sports, you'll know that in a heptathlon, the women who compete are usually amazing and the best in class at two of the sports, sometimes three, and just good enough with their times at everything else. I think that's a much more realistic and healthy way of approaching balance and time and, all of that kind of stuff, because that's reality, right? You cannot be amazing at work and life and eat organic home cooked meals and, be sort of working out at the gym 6 hours a week or whatever. Like, that's just not physically possible. And anyone who is telling you that it is possible probably has a ton of paid help making all that other stuff possible for them, right? So for most normal people, you have to choose, because every minute, every ounce of energy, every ounce of brain space, every resource you have in your command that you spend and invest in one thing is, of course, by definition, unless you can defy the laws of physics, an ounce of energy and time and resource, et cetera, that you cannot invest in something else. So choose what you're going to invest in. Choose the few, 2, 3, probably tops, things that you're going to be really excellent at, and just be good enough at everything else. And so the way, I think you were asking a slightly different question, perhaps about maybe something a bit more tangible, but I think it's a bigger question and then sort of the specifics of some of the mechanics of how I have leaned into my personal style of how I use and invest my time is what I refer to as a personal energy map. So it's, again, about being very thoughtful and very aware of what our natural sort of peaks and troughs are throughout the course of a day, a week, a season, a year, et cetera. There will be times for all of us where, we're really, really good at sort of handling detail. There will be other times where we feel, we're much more sociable and we're good at handling, I don't know, maybe business development or conversations with team members or whatever. But for every type of task that we're called on to do, there will be a better time of the day or the week or whatever that we just feel naturally called to do that thing. But instead of leaving it as a guessing game, it's important to sit down and almost track for, however long it takes to find what that pattern is. Track yourself and see, again, where do you feel you have, the energy is right for you to do that sort of negotiation, or the energy is more right for you to have those more thoughtful internal conversations with yourself, whatever it looks like for you. And then whenever possible, to track your activities in alignment with that. So I know that I'm just during a typical week, I am highest energy probably Tuesday through Friday. Mondays are just a write-off for me. I can force myself to do things on Mondays that are, mentally intensive and require me to be on, but it's not my natural tendency. So, when I need to be on, I will try to plan those times during, a Tuesday through Friday slot. Ideally never on a Monday, but if I have to, I will do it. And then doing that for all of the other types of tasks. I'm better at my creative work really, really early in the morning. So if I have to come up with a project design or do some writing, I'll do it early in the morning as opposed to trying to do it any other time of the day, because I know it's just diminishing returns if I try to go against that. So this isn't about, being unrealistic about our expectations. It's about tuning into ourselves, knowing what our patterns are, and then whenever possible, aligning the things that we do, because many of us have some flexibility around when we do certain types of things, to align with when we're most internally ready and, in that sort of headspace to do that kind of activity. And then just making tweaks and accordingly as often as you can, and being, again, very attuned to yourself, as opposed to just constantly reacting to what the world is throwing at you.
Amazing. And I think that is a perfect place and perfect way to end our conversation today. I want to thank Rupal for joining us today and for sharing her insights. Like I said, today is the official US publication day of her book. So if you found any part of this conversation helpful, I promise you, you'll find the book just as interesting. It was a great read. I'm going to share in the chat a link to go find where you would like to purchase it from. And there's lots of options there. And I will also share in the email the TED Talk that we talked about, some other things that Rupal has done in her career that have been super inspiring and interesting to me. But thank you, Rupal, for joining us today. Thank you for everyone in the chat who has joined us as well. We're really happy that you're here, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. And yes, anyone who wants to connect, please come connect with me. I'd love to continue the conversation offline, or I guess online, but separately.
Yeah, no problem. You guys have a good rest of your day.
Bye-bye.